want to, in this video, wrap up my discussion of Chapter 2 of this book, Chapter 2 being what makes a right act right. So I'm going to label this question, the chapter heading, with a little asterisk. So finally, we've got the pieces now, and I want to sort of pull them all together to answer the question, what makes a right act right? So there's a number of them. There's probably different ways you could formalize this, but I hope this is clear and gets to Ross's point, because I think, as I said, the chapter could use a little editing. But so I'm leaving out some of the things in Ross. I just want to zero in on his answer that you say at the end of reading, I'm not sure what makes a right act right. Okay, first off, consequences of an action don't matter. That's not what makes a right act right. And if you notice throughout this chapter, there's lots and lots of criticisms of consequentialism, namely utilitarianism in all of its forms. But roughly, Ross thinks that utilitarianism, it really doesn't fit the facts of our moral reasoning. We don't really reason like utilitarians. We reason more like Kantians. We think more in terms of duties and obligations than we just do in terms of creating benefits for others. So, and also, that's not how we relate to people. We have multitudes of relationships with people. We're not just organisms that provide goods and boost happiness of other organisms, or that other organisms are just our beneficiaries. That's an oversimplification. Once again, utilitarianism does not fit the facts of our moral life. It's too simplistic, way too simplistic, too reductionist. Every relation, my relation to my wife, to my kid, to my dog, to my mom, everything, that they're just beneficiaries of goods that I can produce for them. He thinks that's a distortion, that's an oversimplification, a gross reductionism. So consequences, goodbye, that's not important. Prima facie duties, remember, that's the big thing. So that's what people said was Ross's big move, was to introduce the notion of prima facie duties. And you can find this in earlier thinkers as well. But prima facie duties, these are involved in answering our question. And what are we talking about? Like keep promises, duties of gratitude, duties of self-improvement, etc., etc. So there's a variety of them. Go through, have a look at Ross's list. He doesn't say the list is complete, but we've got lots and lots of prima facie duties. These are serious obligations. They are true, they are real, they are independent of us, and they are recognized by us, because in the end, they are self-evident. Not to babies, not to children, but they are self-evident to a properly educated, mature mind. Remember, Ross has been talking about generational improvement, individual improvement. You come to just see that if you make a promise, you should keep it. But while it's true that if you make a promise, you should keep it, Ross does not want to get trapped in that Kantian absolute clash of duties where you can't get out of the clash and then you're frozen. So the prima facie duty is a kind of weakening, and remember the analogy with physical forces that I talked about in the previous lecture. We resolve physical forces, well, basically we combine them such that we get what the little metal ball will do given the force of gravity, given magnetism, etc., etc. We put the things together. All of those forces are true. The theory of gravity is true. Magnetism is true. It's true that you should obey, or you should keep your promises. It's true that you should tell the truth. It's due, all these things. So we've got to resolve them. Again, we're going back to that model, that physics model that I talked about in a previous lecture. Go back and have a look at it if you don't know it or if you've forgotten it. So in our lives, okay, now let's put all this together. So in our lives, we are constantly in situations. Right? That's what we do. We move around the world and we're in moral situations all the time. Big, complex situations. I'm just going to call them S. Ross doesn't do this, but I'm just trying to illustrate what I think he's up to. Where there are several prima facie duties, right? And we have also, in addition, he slips this in, less stringent obligations as well. And he uses an old Greek expression, ante estese en Chrysos, which comes from Aristotle, and my Greek accent might be horrible, but fortunately no ancient Greeks are going to be able to laugh at me. But in any case, that's roughly talking about the rest is just mere perception. Now, aesthesis is a little more complicated, and Ross would know this because he did a lot of work in Aristotle. But aesthesis is like awareness. So Ross is allowing for a complexity of self-evident and other things we're aware of in terms of things we should do. So you're walking around, you're in situations, there's all kinds of things that you should do at a given moment, right? So we live in conflicts of duties, right? Constantly. That's what we live in, right? And so in S, this big sort of thing, in a given S, like where there's all these possibilities for several prima facie duties, there are possible actions, possible things you could do, right? So you're like that little metal sphere, and reality just presents you with all kinds of possibilities and all kinds of prima facie duties, right? So what happens? Well, let's think about, again, Ross doesn't do this, but I'm trying to follow his physics example. So in S, there are possible actions A1, A2, A3, little dot, 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 up to AN. So there's all kinds of possibilities. Which one is the right action? The ARS, right? So the right action in S. Notice it's contextualized to S. So that's a key. What makes a right act right? It's going to be, well, in a given situation. There's no such property that makes every right act right. Okay, so get that one out of the way. It's going to be a complex within a given situation. So what makes a right act right? Well, a right act right in the context of a particular situation S. Very Aristotelian. Aristotle was like that. Well, it's when he talked about virtue, virtue was, according to the situation, it was a mean considered, and it wasn't just simply a mathematical thing. You had to consider it according to the situation. So this is a kind of situated ethics. It's not relativism, but you have to take into account what's going on. The prima facie duties, those we know of, and we see which ones apply to the situation, just like we know the laws of mechanics and we see which ones are applying to the situation. If there's if the magnet's not there, then the laws of magnetism don't apply. All right, so once we've got that, we figured out, okay, the possible actions, and we want to know which is the right action. Well, each AI, so like, each AI, so A1, A2, A3, each one of these will be right in terms of some prima facie duties, wrong in terms of other prima facie duties. So I'm walking, and I'm walking down the street, and I'm on my way, and I decide that I'm going to go and take my mom to the hospital. Remember that one about going for coffee with you versus taking my mom, and my action of going to the hospital to take my mom, or going to take my mom to the hospital. That's an action. That's one of the AI. I could do something else, but one of the AIs in that situation, as I'm on the sidewalk, I guess, is I could go take my mom to the hospital. Now that's going to be right from the perspective of, let's say, a duty of obligation to my mom, or, we can unpack it. It's correct in terms of one duty, to alleviate pain, or, because I'm helping my mom feel better, they're going to give her some medication to make her feel better. So duty to alleviate suffering. But it's wrong because, from another perspective, because I promised I'd go for coffee with you. So that particular action will be correct from one angle, one prima facie duty, and wrong. So right from one, wrong from another. So get that idea of all the possibilities can now be characterized in terms of rightness from the perspective of one prima facie duty, wrong from the perspective of another prima facie duty. And so what you've got, if you think about this, each AI, all these things will have ratios on them. And so AI, if each AI, each member in this set will have a ratio of right to wrong. You can't calculate this quite the way that physics works, but this is a structural representation of the kind of reasoning that we would look at it in sort of this Rossian point of view, right? Because we're just looking at it in terms of prima facie duties, not consequences. So the answer to the question, what makes a right act right, is that the right action in a given context S, it will be that AI in S, this one of the set, with the greatest ratio of right to wrong. So you're resolving all these prima facie duties with respect to the possible actions, And the one action is the one where it just has the greatest right over wrong in terms of your prima facie duties. Remember, as Ross said, this is analogous to the way that physicists and mathematicians will work out problems. It's not an identity, but it gives you, and how we do it. We're like, okay, well, if I go to the hospital, it's right from one angle, and so it's more right from the prima facie duty of alleviating suffering, and maybe the prima facie duties I would have to family members. And we often reason like this. Well, I know I promised you this, but I'm going to put my duties to my family over my duties to keep a promise. I mean, most of us have experienced something like that, where people will prioritize. So prioritizing, comparing, looking at possible actions with respect to our obligations, and sort of organizing them, and then picking the one that we think has the greatest amount of right to wrong. But none of these are perfect, right? All of them involve balancing. In that sense, it's a little like utilitarianism, because utilitarians are all about they're kind of like bean counting results. So there's a structural analogy with utilitarianism, in the sense of, as the utilitarian would look at, possible actions, the goods that would come out of this versus the bad. Each action produces some good, produces some negative. I'm going to pick that action with the greatest amount of good with the greatest amount of good over bad. In the same thing, it's analogous here, that the greatest amount of prima facie duty good over violating prima facie duties. So in that sense, remember that it's always contextualized. There's no property that just we can pick and sort of put in your pocket and then say, yeah, and if that applies to it, then that's the right thing to do. You can never get away from analyzing. There's a decision that goes in, and the decision, the judgment of coming up with the final ARS, right? Getting this, right? It sounds, be careful. Like I use the term ratio. It sounds again like it's mathematical, but it's not. It's a lot like a judgment in literary or art criticism, where you're weighing things, but different people might come up with different answers. There truly is an answer, but we just, according to Ross, we can never have that kind of certainty in morals, except way up here on the prima facie duties. Those are self-evident once your mind is properly trained. But figuring out the actual the ARS, that's not that kind of a judgment. It's not an a priori or a self-evident judgment. It's more like a literary judgment. So now it's certainly possible that the ARS arrived at through a Rossian style of analysis may overlap with what the utilitarian says. In other words, so a given action, so you and I are walking along and I say, what should I do? And you reason it out in your head from a utilitarian perspective, right? And you say, you should go break your promise and take mom to the hospital. And I go, hey, that's what I came up with. And let's say I didn't know that you were using utilitarian analysis. I presumed you were using Rossian. And I say, hey, we agree. And you say, yeah, I read John Stuart Mill, and that's how I got there. And I'd say, wait a second, you got the right result, but you used the wrong methodology. So Ross would admit clearly that there might be different routes that get to the ARS, but the utilitarian methodology, that was just a happy accident, right? So there will be lots of cases where the utilitarian reasoning would lead you away from the Rossian reasoning. Like if you make a promise and let's say the difference is not as great in terms of the goods, or the goods of either breaking or holding the promise are equal, the utilitarian doesn't have an answer. But as a Rossian, you would have an answer. You keep your promise. So in that sense, keep in mind that just because a utilitarian and a Rossian might agree on specific situations, maybe in a particular S, they might agree on the ARS, they're agreeing for very different reasons. So the pathway to the ARS could be quite different. And in other situations, they'll come up with totally different answers. So there can be accidental overlap. And in many times the ARS, from a Rossian perspective, right? It's not necessarily that which is going to produce the most good, but it is going to be the one that has this most favorable ratio of the prima facie duty right to prima facie duty wrong. Okay, so that's basically Ross's story in the first couple of chapters. And remember that what makes a right act right? Well, it's a complex and it's contextualized. And that's, I would say, puts them very much in the Aristotelian camp when it comes to ethics. And again, utilitarians think like this too. But Ross has that key idea of a prima facie duty. So he keeps his link to Kant as well.